I'm Brian Troutwine.
And I'm Bruce Tate. Brian, you've dedicated a lot of your career to talking about failure. It seems to me to be a little bit of an odd topic. What's up with that?
I am interested in why things fail so that we can avoid failure. And it sort of turns out we can't avoid failure per se, but we can mitigate failure. And I'm very interested in that as an academic topic and as a professional topic.
That's all the talks about explosions and meltdowns and dust bowls.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think, especially in my talks, there's been a focus on these sort of like outsized failures. Even though in my own work, most failure modes are substantially less exploding. The sort of reason I focus on failures that are historically interesting is it grabs an audience's attention. But there is a method of looking at well-studied failures that allow you to feed that back into your daily work as a software engineer or as just a citizen.
That makes a lot of sense, and it's going to be a lot of fun to talk about.
Bruce, can you introduce yourself? What do you do?
I am in education. It's interesting that our careers are so different, but they've kind of taken us to the same path. I've focused on writing about mostly the Elixir language, but also other programming languages as well. And I've been trying to teach the next generation of functional developers. And this is at a company called Groxio.
So I think it's pretty clear from our professional lives that we have different focuses. What sort of interests you in talking with me about failure?
Yes, it's interesting from our very first conversation. I remember we were at a conference in, I think it was San Francisco, right? Mm-hmm. And we were talking about failure then. And it really struck me that this was something that I needed and something that I really needed to know, mainly from the perspective of being an optimist. I'm used to designing for things that will work the first time and work right every time. I don't really think about failure systems. And I think as developers, we need to. I think that this is actually pretty common in the programming profession, not across the board, but it's a broad enough opinion so that we need to be vaccinated. And this kind of inoculation is exactly what we're looking for. So I'm really interested in our coming conversations about failure. So Brian, why do we need one more conversation about this? You've had a career full of these. Why do we want a series about mistakes? Can't I just run tests one more time?
Yeah, so I guess there's kind of two questions there. Why do we need another conversation about it? I think the answer to that is it always bears repeating because the consequences can be so high. But I think the second question there sort of has an answer to the first embedded in it. This is not really about mistakes. This is about what Charles Perrow called normal accidents or system accidents. So there are definitely a thing in the world, or there's a thing in the world called mistakes. Like if I forget to tie my shoes and I go walk outside and I trip and I fall down the stairs, that is a mistake. But if I go walk outside and I have a heart attack, that is a systems accident. I will eventually have some problem with my heart. A systems accident is a thing that is inherent to the system that will eventually happen in the lifetime of that system if it runs long enough. It is not necessarily about mistakes so much as it is about the inherent properties of the system under examination.
Yeah, I wish I had taken that class.
Well, you would have seen a lot of people get chopped up in industrial blenders, so it was worth the pass.
Excellent. So we're going to talk about a number of failures, one a week, and we're going to try to keep these pretty short. We'll see how that goes. I know that we both like to talk. So Brian, over the course of this series, we're going to take one failure, and that'll give us an opportunity to kind of put ourselves in the places as things were happening, and maybe to talk about the failure systems. And then the series is called Why Things Failed and What We Can Do About It. So this will give us an opportunity to talk about what we can do. So what's first?
I think the first one that I want to talk about sounds cutesy, but didn't really have a cutesy impact on people's lives is the Great Boston Molasses Flood of 1919.
I know that that's one that many people in our audience will not have heard about before. What happened?
Yeah, so it's definitely not one that would have come up necessarily unless you live in Boston or the surrounding area. So um, in January of 1919, a storage tank at the Purity Distilling Company that held 12 tons of molasses ruptured, and 12 tons of molasses uh, spread out from this tank at around 35 miles an hour, and it swept up 150 people, buildings, dogs, horses, and it killed 21 of them. So if you can imagine, you're standing in January in Boston in a great big coat, and you hear this loud. People said it sounded like an explosion or the loudest gunshot they had ever heard, or a train derailing or something like that. Everyone sort of struggled for an explanation of what it sounded like because no one had ever heard 12 tons of molasses escape from a tank before. Um, Imagine you're standing that and then you see this great brown wave coming at 35 miles an hour, one of the fastest things you've ever seen in your life, rushing toward you, and then it picks you up and sweeps you along. And because it's relatively warm and viscous, you sort of surf on top of it until you start to slowly sink in it, and then you're stuck.
Now you said buildings. So here's a picture of one of the buildings. Um, can you walk us through that?
Yeah. So the picture we're looking at is, I believe, Firehouse 31, which was near to the tank. So it's worth noting that this was a huge tank. It's on the grounds of the Purity Distilling Company, which is in North Boston, or was. It's no longer there. And because it was sort of a factory port area, there was a firehouse near to the site. What happened is a lot of the buildings in this area were hit by the wave of molasses and sort of rode up on top of the molasses and then were carried along. This firehouse seems to have been slammed by a molasses wave, but had a relatively stronger connection to its foundation. You can actually see here the firefighters have had to dip their ladder in the molasses while they're doing their work, and you can see the molasses hanging off the ladder. It took months and months and months to clean all this mess up, but people would come and they would have a look at the molasses flood, and they would track molasses all over Boston. So apparently for a year, kind of no matter where you went in Boston, stuff was sticky, which is, again, cutesy, but it's not cutesy on the day that it happened.
So I look forward to that discussion. What's next?
So I think the next thing I would like to focus on is something called the bug herd round the world. So it's inspired by a paper by John Garman. The first flight of Space Shuttle Columbia, STS-01, was scrubbed in April of 1981 because of a computer bug, because of a synchronization issue in a real-time computer system, or between two computer systems, I should say. No one dies. The mission is eventually very successful. It's the first flight of the space shuttle. But it's sort of a famous example of a bug in a computer system that was extremely reliable, that had thousands and thousands and thousands of man hours to find bugs like this, but still suffered a non-catastrophic failure, but mission-stopping failure.
You have a personal connection to this mission, don't you?
Yeah, it turns out my wife's grandfather worked as a press officer at NASA during the Apollo project, and then during the early shuttle flights. And we have sort of paraphernalia from the STS-01 flight.
So that's where all of the NASA talks have come from. Remember the Mercury, Gemini.
Yeah, amusingly enough, I was into that before I met my wife. Sort of the reason why I have focused on NASA for my talks is they have a lot of open material. So it is an excellent example of an organization that cares very much about failure and sort of rooting failure out, but is also not shy about publishing why things have failed, in part so that we can learn what to do about it.
That sounds like an interesting conversation. What's next?
What I want to focus on next is the Dust Bowl.
A sound choice, a good choice. This is one that people would have heard about in high school.
The Dust Bowl is interesting to me because it is the result of a natural process, the relative waning and waxing of precipitation in the Great Plains, combined with a human agricultural process. In good years, looks like a good idea, but in bad years, especially with the methods at the time, result in mass human displacement, result in the wind erosion of topsoil in one of the most fertile agricultural areas of the United States. So I think what interests me about the Dust Bowl is it is the consequence of human action combined with a regular natural process. So almost an unwillingness to cope with a natural process and a desire to best it through industrialization. I'm sort of very interested in industrialization as a concept, and I think the Dust Bowl is a really excellent example of that, because when the agricultural processes of the United States in that time period worked, they really did work. But as soon as things go a little sideways, you have mass displacement of people, you have massive loss of life, crippling of children, you have very fertile topsoil from the middle of the country sort of deposited into the Atlantic Ocean, where it is then subsequently lost. And none of that really necessarily had to happen. It was human arrogance that sort of forced it to happen, combined with the natural process, of course.
So that sounds like it's right in our wheelhouse.
I'd say so.
Okay, so that sounds like a great list. We're going to do the Boston Molasses Flood, which I'm irrationally excited about. We're going to do the bug herd around the world, which I've heard a talk of yours about before, but I'm interested to dive in a little bit. And we're going to do the Dust Bowl, which is something that's always fascinated me, being from the Mid-South, just a tick south and a tick east of that area of geography. So if you like what you see, go ahead and give us a like, give us a follow, and we'll knock these three out. And if there's enough interest, who knows, maybe we'll extend this series beyond those three. So that about wraps things up. I'm Bruce.
And I'm Brian for Why Things Fail.